Thank you. Welcome. Welcome, Walter. Welcome to Chicago's your home, but
Thank you.
welcome. I am nervous. Do you know when you meet the hero of your childhood and your teenagerhood and the rest of your life? Well, that's today. I lived for many years on 96 and Madison. So Walter's landscape is home. It's where I go on Sundays to get coffee. Walter's landscapes are also the example we throw at people when they tell us that we're only 3% in the profession. Walter's landscapes are strength and joy. So it's an absolute honor to have you here. So what does it feel to be every little kid in landscape architecture? How heavy is to be a role model? How does it feel to be someone's role model and dream?
How does it feel?
How do you address it when you have your 300, 500 enormous audiences looking after the amazing career you built and the path you paved?
Well, it's nice to be back to Chicago. Chicago feels like second home. My mic is not working, or maybe I have to put my lips on the mic. Can you hear me now? It's great to be back in Chicago. Mary Jane Jacobs, the Art Institute, was just this amazing resource for me and my career. And you know, it's like one doesn't set out when you start a career, you don't know where you're going to end up. And I would have to say that I've probably just been one of the luckiest people to follow, I guess, follow my own heart and my own desires versus looking at the profession around me and going, I want to be like that person, right? And I do think having mentors has just been a great thing to give you strength, someone in front of me to help and guide. So those have been things that, you know, have opened doors in just different places. But I think probably the one major thing that I tell my students is I remain curious. And I think as long as you remain curious in our world, living in this democracy, there's always going to be something for you to do. And if you look at every project as a beginning versus an end, there's also, you can define a career and not a job.
Walter, in that path of curiosity, what would you say are those principles, are those ideas that you keep coming back to that are essentially in your practice, in your work, in your teaching?
People, right? I keep coming back to people. I'm blown away by how much, very little discourse there are in design schools about people. And the only reason why we design is for people, right? I mean, because again, if we're not here, things will take care of themselves to a certain degree, but it's us. And one of my mentors, Garrett Ekbo, once told me, he says, Walter, the only reason why we're called upon is for when things change. And that always stayed with me. It's like, well, when things change. And so every project that we have is change, right? It's not about even keeping something the same, there's change. And so just this notion that, you know, I'm not in the game of preservation or even conservation to a certain degree. I'm in the game of working with people and figuring out how people want to live in the places that they want to live. And the coolest thing is to get someone who has lived in a place to see it anew. That's amazing. Like I remember a project we had, someone came up to me and was, why are you planting all of these damn palm trees? And I was like, these palm trees have been here for 100 years, but they just never saw them because of just how the space was designed. And all we did was we shaved them, gave them beautiful haircuts, you know, fed them for a year, and people saw them. But it's those little things to me that are really powerful, right, in the machinations when we make things in the environment, is getting people to see that the river is running backwards, getting people to see that the lake is not an ocean, getting people to see that You live in a wetland, getting people to understand that a floodplain is always a floodplain. You know, it's like my basement's wet. Well, you live in a floodplain, right? But it's these kinds of things that we've kind of almost erased, and so people don't have an understanding of the places in which they live.
People, that speaks to me of a generous heart, right? It's present in your work and in your life. Always going back to that idea of the preservation is transformation, so it's just that. And the generous heart, that I believe kind of like, because your heart is so generous, always finding that kind of space in people, that takes us to someone that is an architect, an urban thinker, a landscape architect. I think that generosity is that expansive, right? So that generosity in your life to welcome all of those disciplines in your everyday life, how do you experience that multiplicity?
Boredom, you know, I just get bored, right? I mean, when I got out of architectural school, went into an office, I was like, I don't want to do window schedules. Maybe I'll go and do landscape. After landscape, I was like, I'm tired of doing planting plans. Maybe I'll go back to art, you know, just finding those places. And the other point is really off now. Oh, it's back on. These professions are they're really confining the professions. So there are these boxes around, thank you. There are boxes around each profession, and even at my school at Berkeley, the architects are over here, the planners are over here, and the landscape guys are over here. We have a tower. Who's in the tower? Who's in the tower? The architects, of course. So they're in the towers, landscape is on the 3rd floor, and planning is on the 2nd floor. Now, how do you create interdisciplinary anything with that? And so the landscape people don't want to go up in the tower, the architects don't want to come down, the planners are over here, and so everybody's designing their own little world. And you go to a lot of different universities and schools and you see that, and then you go on to practice. And if I get a job and my firm has it, it's one thing, but if an architect hires me, it sucks, because now they're telling me what I have to do. And there are very few that are generous enough that want to have a conversation. Our last project, the International African American Museum, the late Harry Cobb was probably he was the first time I met an architect, a real architect. He called me up, he says, I need you on a project. And he goes, I'm going to raise the building up, and this is all you. The building is not going to be rhetorical at all. This is all about landscape. And this is Harry Cobb. Right, I mean, and that generosity blew my mind. And I've only worked with a few who've had that generosity. And so it's really hard then that profession is actually reflecting the institution and vice versa. And you then have to find a way then to create projects. And we found that through art making, through urbanism, sometimes landscape, sometimes architecture, you never know what you're going to need in a circumstance. And I got tired of going into places and saying, if I plant these trees, it's going to solve your problems. If I do this community garden, man, you guys are all going to have food. And it doesn't work that way. And I started to see these as, okay, I can plant a tree to provide shade, to provide biomass, to do a lot of things. But I have to understand that medium. And to me, it's the kind of collision of these different disciplines that will allow for that richness to come out. It's that space in between. You know, for housing, it is the site plan. But now housing, there is no site plan. They're all the same. They're all on top of a parking garage, right? And then there's a courtyard in the middle. They're all the same. And so it's like, how did we get here? Well, we got here because someone's leading this diagram and saying this diagram works, and so therefore we don't need to rethink it.
So you will say segregation is stronger in the intangible, in a way.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, segregation is real, not just in the profession, but it's real with people. And I was telling my students, it's like I grew up. Early part of my life, I probably didn't experience it, but I lived in apartheid America. And we don't think about it that way. It's only been 50 some odd years where we were been legislated to live together. It's not like we said, okay, let's do it. That was a law. And there was a law that also said we can be separate but equal. Right? And so if we think about those things, we then have an understanding then why we have these issues in wanting to deal with people, particularly people that don't look like ourselves. And so I've had people tell me, people non-black colleagues, to say I can't work in black communities anymore. And I said, you can't? And they said, because they don't listen to me. And I went, wow. You know, that kind of like just still stays with me. But this notion that there's not going to be any dissonance, that there's not going to be any challenges when I go into places. And so a lot of people I know don't do public work because they don't want to deal with people and the issues that come along with it, like poverty, right? All of these things. And so that's why it's nice to just design nice, shiny buildings, nice, verdant landscapes next to the river. It's nice to do all of those things.
But why would we, right?
Well, you can do them both. I mean, we do nice, shiny stuff down by the river, but we also do things in the hood. And it's that relationship that, for me, is that I want there to be equity in those ideas. And I remember the first design I ever did 25 years ago for a community. I went and presented the work, and they didn't like it. They didn't respond. They didn't understand it. Because I had went in and I did the typical low-income presentation. The minimal, because the project wasn't paying. Renderings, who cared? Just put some color on it, no models, just some, the lowest common denominator. And I went home and I was like, well, why don't they like it? And I looked at the drawings. I was like, okay, I'm going to change the drawings. And I ended up collaging the houses in the perspective drawings. And I then took crayons and made the trees red and made them like really, really colorful. And then I made models, like I would do for the client who pays money. And then I went back to the community with this work, and people were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe that it was for them. And I hadn't thought of it in that way, but they couldn't believe that someone had made that much work for their little meager project. And since then, every project we work on, no matter here or there, we put in the same amount of work. And we give them the same amount that we would give for the $200 million museum. This $3 million space gets the same, right? And so the prefixes of no maintenance, low income, all of that, we try to remove that moniker. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to design something, if you're an architect and says, you're doing low income housing. So you start out, okay, I'm doing low income housing. That's what you're doing. So you're going to think about low income the whole time. And if you just get rid of low income and say, I'm doing housing, it changes everything, right? And we've forgotten these very simple things. I mean, we're doing tiny houses now, guys. Tiny freaking houses, right? I mean, really, I can see it on the home show, but we're doing this in schools now. And we forgot that this country was built on small building types. My culture produced one, which is a shotgun house. My grandmother lived in it all of her life. And we can't even make a shotgun house for poor people today. It's just mind-blowing when you kind of think about, well, how did we get to these places? And so I think we really don't care that much for the architecture per se. We just care enough for the next new shiny object, right? Which is tiny houses now.
It goes back to the idea of generosity in really the meaning of design justice. We talk a lot about design justice, but it lies on that very fact that you deliver the same emotion and quality, no matter who is that client. And will you share some stories of your reflections on how is that very capacity of finding justice through generosity in your practice and everything you do a path to building real trust with every constituency you work? We know that when that trust is built, that line disappears between what a client and a design. The blurring of that, we have observed through your example how that is a path towards building trust, long-lasting trust. Trust is landscape itself, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we hear a lot of social justice. We hear the term justice a lot in the last few years, and I always return to Richard Pryor, the comedian, and the idea of justice. He says, just us. But this notion, though, is just truth. When you think about truth, right? Which today, truth is one of these, again, fuzzy zones. But this notion to go into a place and just be truthful, to me, is so liberating, right? And to talk about the truth in ways in which people understand it because they live in that place. And that's where, to me, we form the most amount of, I think, the bonds that happen in a neighborhood where you can come in and speak truth to the elephant in the room. You saw one of the projects in the back was Freed, was the statue that says F-R-E-E-D, and it's a project in Arlington and Virginia. And the people who live in Knock, which is Green Valley, which is right outside of DC, they're descendants from the first freedmen's village that was in Arlington Cemetery. And that diaspora, I think they were there 25 to 30 years post antebellum, and then they moved out into Arlington, and slowly they're the last generations are still there, and they wanted a space to commemorate it. And if you walk around Arlington, the idea of freedmen's, they put it on the bridge. It's like literally become a brand, right? It's one of those historic signs that they have, and it talks about the Freedmen's Village, but then there's like the Freedmen's Bridge. So there's all this like things, and I was like, that's interesting how they're using the word. And so we started having a conversation with the community just about this idea of freed men and freed women. And then this conversation folded into the Aboriginals, Native Indians were called freedmen and freed women, right? And so this idea of like, do we still want to be thought of in that way? And I posed the question, is it different that we were freed? Right? That someone says, okay, you can go now, right? Versus getting freedom, right? Those are two different things. I fought for my freedom versus I was freed. And we started having this conversation about, looking over your back. Why are we always looking over our back? Are they coming, right? And just the psychosis that comes with that. And led into this amazing conversation in the community. And I remember someone had just returned, I don't know what my mic is doing, just returned from Iraq, and he stood up, and he said, Mr. Hood, I love your mind, I love that, but it should be freedom. And then people in the neighborhood start going, no, it should be freed. And there was this amazing conversation around just the terminology. And to me, that's when projects really start to define themselves to a certain degree, because I'm bringing another way to interpret a circumstance and a larger set of constructions for people then to deal with. So again, the truth is, is really digging and really having the courage to then, right, present it. And sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes the truth is really, really tough to swallow.
How do you handle those not easy ones?
You have to basically be there. You have to be there. We're working in Emory right now, the university down there, and they have a project for twin memorials. They have an Oxford campus and an Atlanta campus. The Oxford campus was built by enslaved labor, right? They were slaves. And then the Atlanta campus was built on top of 7 plantations, right? And this is all through the church, right? And to tell that story, now they're telling that story, but these are the things that you have to then hold up, because at some point we're going to make something that the institution has to stand behind, right? And so there comes that moment where it's like either, you stick to it or you move away from it. I'm trying to be vague because the project is not done.
And in that is speaking truth through design and through rooting openness and truthfulness and trust in every work. This kind of work can be really difficult, not only intellectually or technically speaking, but it takes a toll on the human. To all of our designers here in the audience and everybody working in speaking truth, how do you replenish, and what's the role of your team in the collective truth telling?
I mean, I'm maintained by, just having to maintain, and I have a good group of people around me at my studio who've bought into the work, and what I mean by that, they bought into what it takes to do the work. And not everyone is one of my principals says, we were interviewing the other day, she was like, not everyone can be at Hood Design, right? Because at a certain moment, there's that breaking point, right? Where Walter comes in and goes, okay, here's 30 scenarios. We gotta figure out how to present these 30, right? Where most people, it's like, we're gonna do 2 schemes or 3 schemes, right? But the way we work is, we work through scenario building and through this kind of prolific way of talking about things, and so that you don't get stuck with a single idea. And I had a firm from Chicago come and work with my colleagues, faculty, for team building and goal setting. And she said something, she said, you have to do at least something 13 times before you can get to something new. So if you're iterating, and I was like, 13? So I haven't been lying all these years, because I just made it up that you got to do 15, right? So I was pretty close. But this notion that if you can get past 13 or 14 ideas that you've had, you're pretty much wiping it out and starting anew, and you'd be surprised what you find, but it's exhausting, right? Can you imagine every project you get, you got to set the table, and it becomes exhausting. But it's one of those things that I do now in a much more, it's just a natural thing because I've been doing it for so long. And so it's really hard training people, right, to believe in that. Because there is something about, I don't know if you guys are designers, something about having an idea and not knowing how to get there, versus thinking you have an idea, going to Pinterest and grabbing it and then making it. That's not an idea, right? But an idea is a kind of a thought. And that thought is like, how do I get there? And so I might have to write about it a little bit. I might have to make some models. I have to figure out how to make that thing happen. And it's really, really tough, because it doesn't happen when you want it to happen. You could be like on an airplane, taking a shower or whatever, it's just gonna happen. But you have to believe it's going to happen. And that's the hard part of design. And that's the optimism of design, right? That's the purity of impulse to a certain degree, right? That you do enough, that there's gonna be this impulsion that happens, right? That it's gonna come out. And a lot of that I learned here in Chicago at the Art Institute, but a lot of that is just in being in different contexts and knowing that that's what it takes for the work to manifest.
We talked about this a little bit before, and I'll go back to what are the conversations you're enjoying the most nowadays. When you describe the iterative process, it feels to me like that's where you find that's where one finds the energy in a way. In those 13 times, it's like, woo, what am I gonna draw next? Yeah. Like, it might seem exhausting, but it's actually energizing in a way. I wonder. And then through those iterative process, what are those iterative conversations that you are finding yourself nowadays more attractive or more interested in?
From understanding the question, what are the places, the things that are interested? Someone in my office was like, do we want to take on another enslaved project, right? I mean, there are these, after George Floyd is just like every university is reckoning with, right? And so how many more of those projects do you want? And so we have to literally come at them in different ways, right? That they can't all mean the same thing, right? Which they do, right? If I see another circle, we get circles. It's become the kind of the go-to. And I'm not critiquing the projects per se, but it's kind of like, just give me one of those and then I don't have to deal with it, right? And a lot of places are doing that. And for us, we're trying to figure out how not to let places off the hook because they're different stories. I mean, the story that happened up in New England, Brown is really different than the story that happened in Atlanta. It's just really different. But how do you talk about it? And can our medium actually do all the work, or do you need other things? But the big conversations that I'm more interested these days in is just the language of how we refer to things and how underdeveloped our communities are. And I don't mean they don't have buildings, but I mean underdevelopment like, okay, separate, but you can have two of them, okay? You get one school, you get the other school. We're gonna give you guys both the same schools, but we're gonna walk away from this school and we're gonna stay with this school, right? That's the Black community in America, right? We got these things and people just walked away. Intentionally, to keep them underdeveloped to a certain degree, because if all of those things stay underdeveloped, then you can say like, see, I told you, they can't take care of their stuff. And I heard this so many times, but then you look at the other places like, oh, that's because you got subsidies over here. You got all this other stuff going on. That's why ours looks different. It might be the same, but that's the place where I want to have more and more conversations, but those conversations are not being had, right? If we can produce a freeway, we can get rid of a freeway. Right? If we can come up with an idea of moving 60,000 cars how to move cars, right? I mean, it's almost like there are certain places where it's like, we can't do that anymore. We have to just only do this now. And I think design should be able to get us to see that we can do these other things. And so I'm hoping that this next generation takes those things on, because the world is changing right in front of us, and it's not on fire. It's not on fire the way the news and everything wants to make it. There are opportunities to do things out there. It's just that if we're always at the extreme, we never see the kind of the everyday, right? And the everyday is like where we want to do most of our work, right? Not at the edges where there's always crisis. Like I gave this lecture at Harvard during COVID, and I was talking about justice or something, and the first question that came from the landscape architects were, so Mr. Hood, what do you think of sea level rise? Like after an hour of talking about race and all this stuff, it's like, and I'm like, I don't think about it. I don't. I mean, I don't lie awake up at night, like, oh my God, the bay is gonna flood me. I'm not thinking about that. Those are geological, right, to a certain degree. And so, again, in this kind of moment, I'm more thinking about the guy who's sleeping below my window at night on the public sidewalk. Like, how did he get there? And why does it take 4 months? Right? I mean, that to me is the bigger question. Yeah.
People, generosity, multiplicity, curiosity.
I like all those things.
Right? Those are yours.
I like the accent.
Those are yours. Oh, I can exaggerate it. Anybody here from North London?
On your way.
Oh. Okay. So they would love for you to share some of their experiences and learnings and how all those words found meaning here in Chicago, especially in the third project.
Yeah. No, I've been out there, and I think the work that's being done here locally, incrementally, I think is the right stuff. As we were talking earlier about the idea of the line, right? When the High Line went up, then everybody wants a line, right? And we were talking that, we should not build the trail until you've made the spaces, right? Until you've created. you've re-examined and you pulled out those places and you develop them and you give them some love, then you can bring a trail through. You bring the trail through first, it's hard to get the other stuff, right? And so again, I think this comes in through how we can reimagine how we work and how we see things. But I think this idea of these kind of incremental kind of pieces throughout can grow into something. You don't need to have the big project, and I think that's the other thing with the master plan, right? This idea that I gotta master plan it first before I do it, versus you look at the kind of the grassroots things that are going, if you could somehow enrich those that are already doing the work, you don't need this thing coming down from the sky, because that just spends more money, right? And it doesn't get you anywhere.
And through all that strategy, I can help but looking at this, the imagery also that's playing right behind us. And I'll go back to my my example, how I discovered Walter Hood. Walking to this place to have coffee. It was our favorite garden before we knew you were the designer. It was like, you know, it's this, in New York, it's right on Fifth Avenue, it's this kind of big building for a rich oil, whatever money, very colonial, right across from Olmsted, which we all love Olmsted, not gonna say anything about it, but maybe later. But you have all this, you know, but somehow for my Mexican roommate, like for us, the place where I felt beautiful with everything that beauty can mean. The one place the one space landscape we felt at peace was that coffee shop inside the garden. Because all those ideas, all those values that you live with translate into a particular kind of aesthetics, and I don't know if aesthetic is the word, of atmosphere. Of feeling, of being comfortable, of not being surveilled, of being welcome to live and enjoy. And I wanted to ask you what are some of the ways in which you are planning to continue disseminating such values to the new generation. I heard about an amazing class with 300 people that I think everybody would love to hear about, and your publications coming up as part of that journey.
The first question was?
First was a compliment. No, first was truth-telling, my truth-tellings of how really it's about feeling the atmosphere and feeling free to just be in your spaces. That's close to impossible to achieve, Walter. It's amazing. And then the question was really what are the ways in which you're communicating that as beyond your practice to students, readers, to all your kids that live in my phone that are gonna be blowing it up in a minute, to the future, no? What are your publications, your classes? How are you having these conversations in those spaces?
Well, the project she's talking about is the Cooper-Hewitt Garden in New York, right on Fifth Avenue for the Cooper-Hewitt Museum. And I would say the one thing that's probably continuous through our explorations is history, right? I mean, this is, you know, I'm not a historian, but there is something about when you're having a conversation with the past that, particularly in the US, it's really important because it's really hard to make palimpsest here, right? It's like we don't have ruins, right? We don't like ruins for some reason in this country. It's hard to get a ruin, right? The ruin would just go away. There's a project you'll see in the middle of San Francisco Bay. There's a water tank that is a building on Treasure Island. Over 12 years, we fought to keep the ruin. And not until the last day, the developer comes out and he's like, Walter, we got to get rid of that thing. And he sees it, and he walks through, and he goes, wow, this is like a ruin. But we ended up saving it. But it's this notion that through looking at our past to build palimpsests, to me, that's the one thing, because I have this almost very simple idea in my mind is like, one thing that I would like to know, I want people in the future to know that Walter was here. And I think most people want that. They want something. It's like, oh, there's the cobblestone. Oh, that's where the Hoods live. Or, you know, I mean, you want something to build upon. And when you go to other places, you're able to then understand people for 500 years. I was at the Academy in Rome. We would go on archaeology digs, and the archaeologists would stand at Carthage. There's like nothing but stones and rubble. And they could tell you how that entire city lived, celebrated, partied, sleep. It's all there. And I was like, wow, that's pretty awesome. How do you know that? And they would always use the proverbial we. We know. And that kind of stuck with me. And I came back to America. I was like, we don't have any ruins and we don't know anything. And this notion then of trying to build palimpsests. And so our first project, Lafayette Square, was a fictional project that said, if I go back 100 years, and every time the park had to change, if I could change it, and still keeping with it. And that's where the forum came from, right? There was an observatory there, right? There were all of these things. And so that's the one thread that goes through. And it's not that we're trying to recreate history. It's just the conversation. Because once you start having those conversations, you're becoming part of a larger conversation. It's not then about you, right? And you're hoping then that people in the future will grab something and bring you all forward. And so that's the one thing. And so in my teaching, that's the one thing I try to make students excited by, not the dullness of history, but the joy of history, right? Of how the optimism, right, that some cultures had. We were just talking about brutalism the other day, and at Cal, there's a picture in our magazine of a double-page spread of Worcester Hall, this brutalist building, and they describe it as the ugliest building on campus, right? And you know, it's like, and you hear the guys come around with the students, are like, oh, this is Worcester, the ugliest building on campus. And now even our students are like, oh, this building sucks. This is really awful. And I was like, do you know what brutalism means? And not one of them had an understanding of brutalism in an architectural school. And so that was like, well, brutalism was about community. No, yeah, it was about community. Concrete was cheap. You know, it's about making these spaces, right? But they didn't have an understanding of that. And so again, not having an understanding of the culture you want to be in, then the culture is not that exciting as much, right? And so those are the kinds of things we talk about in the studio, in my work studio, and at school. And I just taught a 230 undergraduate class on sites and cities, where we talked the first half of the class on the politics of design, just the politics.
Amazing.
Right? And the second half is sites. And how do you deal with the politics and make a project? Like this project is political. Probably every project that you see up here is political in some sense. This is Gadsden's Wharf. This is where more than 40% of African slaves crossed over. And we didn't know it until 2015? How's that possible? Where is that? Charleston. In the oldest city in the country, which is, but we'll tell you. But it's all of these things like that, you know, it's political. And there's a reason why it wasn't called out, right? I mean, there's a reason why Charleston calls itself the oldest city. There's a reason why they don't mention slavery. They use servants. So there's a reason why all of these things happen. And so these are political moves because we live in a democracy, right? Where people own property. And collectively we come together at certain points in time and say, we want to do things together. And then other times we go, we don't want to do things together. But that's the democracy. That's what it is. And how do you navigate that, particularly if you work in public space, where today, the first time in my career, probably we invest the least amount in public space in my lifetime. We don't invest in public space, very little.
Or public buildings.
Yeah. So how do you make projects, right? So you try to deal with them face on and try to get somewhere.
In New York, we are selling them to the corporations
yeah.
to
To get them to do it. Yeah. I mean, in my tenure living in Oakland, when I arrived in Oakland, we had a park and recs department. The park and recs department was located on the lake. You walk in there was 2 landscape architects. They were doing all the parks. That's gone. Then we got public works. And these are just people who are just cleaning up. We don't have a parks department. Now public works has become something else. But we don't even have the bureaucracy to maintain it. I think someone told me in 3 of my projects, there's 1 gardener in the entire city. Yeah.
And in that optimistic note, we are happy to take some questions from you.
At this time, if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. Please keep all questions and comments
Take it
brief.
darker.
Excellent. We'll start here in the front.
I don't think I need it. I'm loud.
You mentioned that you don't create public space here. Do you know that for a fact? And could that be because of the American ethos that we all have these homes and we're space hogs? I mean, we have more space per person than any other nation in the world. So how does that relate to public space?
Well, public space is an investment, right? I mean, most of you guys pay taxes. You look at your tax bill, right?
We don't even have good public schools, though, for our taxes.
Same thing. I mean, that's what I'm saying. So people go to private school. You know, they started giving people in the Bay Area vouchers to go and not go to public school. And 2 blocks from my studio is one of the most famed high schools in West Oakland. And what did I hear? Public. And no, it's not good because it's, again, if 1,000 kids go in, 100 come out. It's just this crazy, and no one wants to go send their kids there, so they send their kids up to the hills. And so there's not that investment. And the tax base in my neighborhood is very low because the nonprofits are there and they keep bringing in the prefixes, the low income stuff. And so again, and then the planners say it's gentrification. And I've been living in this place for 25 years and it ain't changed. Right? And so when people are telling me that it's gentrifying, then I'm like, show me, give me proof of that. And all I'm talking about is just a basic level of investment. And this is like sidewalks. I'm not even talking about parks, right? I'm talking about lighting. Our lighting levels in our community are like 5.7, right? I mean, it's daylight outside, right? I go to Berkeley, it's dark. It's like 1.3. So it's like just these little things to me, what I mean by investing in public space. I don't mean parks, I just mean in that shared space. And you're right, in a lot of communities, they're not shared. They're still segregated, right? And so it's really hard to work in communities then where there isn't that level of investment, so. Yes,
Excellent, we'll take one from the right side.
Well, we would be remiss not to mention Aaron Montgomery Ward's efforts and accomplishments with regard to our lakefront here in Chicago, and you need to pay that proper respect and acknowledgement.
To the lakefront.
It is not segregated.
I'm talking about, I'm not talking about parks, I'm talking about communities.
The very best area of any major city that is open to all of the public.
Well, that's good. That's great.
Hi, thank you for coming here. Question about your educating about the politics of development and sites. Do you find yourself as a practitioner educating property owners and people who commission your projects as well?
For their properties or? Yeah, I mean, it depends on what it is. You know, we work in residential areas right now. We're working in the hills of Berkeley, helping someone deal with fire management issues they just bought a house there. So it just depends. But there are these, how can I say, your house still sits in a neighborhood, right? It still sits in a context. And those contexts are very important to basically be a part of. Yes, ma'am.
At the beginning, first of all, I want to thank you both for being here and for giving us this opportunity to peek inside your head and hear your thoughts. So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that, that design happens at change. And then later you said that you're concerned with the everyday. While, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, and, you know, it's just the limits of our brain to be able to see those moments. But could you kind of talk about that a bit more? Because they seem like they're at the opposite end, but things are changing all the time. So, if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. When I mean the everyday, it's like the sidewalks, right? The streets that people use. And during COVID, I got a chance to, you know, be in one place for a long time, and in the neighborhood, I had just moved into the neighborhood, and I didn't know it that well. And just one of the basic things where I was noticing the everyday in this neighborhood, there is a meat distributor. And so every morning at 5 o'clock, tractor trailers come through the neighborhood. And they park on the street, but they make noise. And we were talking to the city, it was like the every day for this community is you're up at 5 in the morning, right, listening to these trucks, you don't have parking, and then there's no investment in the public right-of-way. And so when the trucks pull up to the sidewalk, you can't walk on the sidewalk because they're up on the sidewalk. And to me, the everyday then is, can I make that change? Like, can I have the trucks not come through here so that my everyday experience, right, can be rich, and it doesn't have to be somewhat so complicated. The other part of the everyday is again, in my community in West Oakland, over the last 25 years, we've removed the tree canopy. And Oakland is called Oakland for a reason. And the everyday is you don't have oak trees anymore, right? And it's like, so how can we get the oaks back? Well, we can't because the roads now are so wide, we don't have places to plant them. They don't want to be in a tree pit, right? So it's those kinds of things to really kind of think about, just those basic everyday things. So design's not about a holiday, it's about everything. Yeah. Because I think we forget, you know, you get in your car, I mean, like literally, I don't know about you guys, but COVID like just was like, wow, I had to stop. Because you get in the car, I'm at the airport, I'm off. But all of a sudden you're in one place for a long time and you actually start to see the things that you're missing. Like my neighborhood liquor store turned into a bodega, right? Because people needed food. So they were like, we're gonna have fruit and vegetables and all this. Now they're back to liquor. But I saw for 3 years, it was this everyday thing. Everybody was at the liquor store. So.
We have time for one more question. I'll take one from the left here.
Walter, you've worked in a lot of projects. Do you have a favorite? And if you have a favorite, why?
It's like favorite child, impossible.
It's impossible. It would probably be the first project that I talked about. It's called Cortlandt Creek Park. It was the first kind of professional project we did, and we planted 150 purple leaf plum trees over a 4-block area, 20 feet on center in an alley in one of the poorest neighborhoods in probably the Bay Area. And today, there's probably 120 trees still there, right? And that was the first project that taught me in those places that you gotta go large, right? I mean, you can't come in there going on 35 feet on center, you know, different kinds of trees, you know, like, I remember I proposed it and the city was like, these are monocultural, we can't do that. And the community was like, no, we want red trees. And so every year they bloom. And that bloom over the 5 blocks is pretty mind-blowing with the backdrop it has, which is undevelopment, right? If that makes any sense, right? I mean, to see it, and I would get calls every year, Walter, the trees are blooming, because that was the event that changed for that moment this neighborhood where, you know, drugs and all these other things were. And so that still is a project that still stays in my mind when I think about the power of design, of what it can do. So. I'm sorry? No. I mean, it's exactly what the opposite of what people think. I mean, it actually For some people, it increased their land values a little bit, that they could sell, but they were willing to do it always. But it's bottom land, right? There's a creek, there's hills over here, it's lowland, it's always going to be where working class people live. But it's one of those improvements where even today, there's work being done on the creek and not work being done on the street, right? Even today, that's 25 years later. Right? It's still the same kind of thing being done. So, yep. Doug.
Excellent. Let's give a huge round of applause for our speakers. Thank you for joining us today. You can exit out the doors you entered, and we hope you have an excellent day.